Okay, friend, have a seat because it's time for you to get into more Black literature, and not just because it's still Black History Month. What up, Search fam? Sade here. Welcome or welcome back to the channel. If you are new, my name is Sade. I'm out here curating and co-creating a cool ass life, and I'm getting your book game up. Now, whether this is your first time coming across my little corner of the internet, or you keep coming back and have not joined my internet family, please hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and be made aware of every time I post, which is usually on the weekends. All right, now, as I said, we're going to get you into reading Black literature because why aren't you? You absolutely should. I don't care if it's Black History Month or not. And lucky for you, your favorite internet cousin is a professor of African American studies. So I'm going to give you some book recommendations to get you started in Black literature that I think are going to make them accessible, but also is required reading. And most of these are from authors that you don't hear about much on the internet these days. So let's just get into it. Now, if you see me looking over or down, I'm looking at my laptop, which is where my list is. Okay, so we're going to start with those that I think are the most easily accessible, meaning that you probably could binge read these. And I'm not going to lie to you, I did binge read these. And the first one is Native Son by Richard Wright. Now, Richard Wright was a Chicago writer in the 30s, 40s, and when they were having their Renaissance, overlapping when the Harlem Renaissance was going on. There was Renaissances in more than one place, my friends. And Richard Wright is most well known for Native Son and Black Boy, but he wrote probably like 9 or 10 books in fiction as well as nonfiction essays. And also Big T is that he fell out not only with James Baldwin, who was his mentee, but also Zora Neale Hurston, who was his contemporary. So I have strong feelings about Richard Wright, but one thing that I cannot deny is that especially the fiction was good. And so Native Son is about Bigger Thomas, who is working for this wealthy white family, and the daughter accidentally gets killed. The daughter, does she accidentally get killed? Yeah, I think she accidentally gets killed. And he's like, they're gonna blame me for it. So he, finishes the job. And it's what goes on afterward as he's being pursued by the police, as well as eventually captured and tried. And so it's a really interesting and important conversation about Black maleness and the perception of it in the broader society, and the ways in which it already becomes, I don't want to say abject, that's not the word I'm looking for, but becomes violent and threatening in the eyes of other people, right? Where guilt is already assigned to Black men's beings and bodies. So it's fantastic. The time that I have read Native Son, I've read it in a day or two. It is an easy book to get into, and the prose is not so dense that it's hard to read. So I would definitely suggest Native Son as one to get you into Black literature. Next is an author I don't hear about a lot at all, and that is J. California Cooper, who was one of my favorite Black writers in my teens because my mom owned J. California Cooper's Family as well as A Some Soul to Keep. And I think I read both of them. Family sticks out to me, and it was easy to read for me at my, 14, 15-year-old self, and I loved it. And so the premise of the book is about a woman named Always and 4 generations of her family that go back from enslavement. And so I think as far as women's writing, black women writing about intergenerational things, it was fantastic. So much so that I still remember it today and remember that it was one not that long. It was like 240 pages, but also quite easy for me as a kid to get into. And so I would suggest that. A more contemporary piece of literature that I would put in the black literary pile that is also easy to get into would be Zeal by Morgan Jerkins, which I read last year, maybe year before last. And it was fantastic. This too is an intergenerational family story that sort of starts around lockdown and then goes backwards through emancipation and forward, and how the family comes to get these letters, these love letters that were written between 2 of the ancestors, and are sort of framed within, it's like a romance within a romance. And so that it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. I did it as the audiobook, but I'm sure I could have done it just as easily in the physical copy. So I would say definitely pick that one up. Now, when we talk about Harlem Renaissance books, there are so many, right? And the ones that I'm going to share with you are, again, ones that I don't quite hear people talk about as much. And first, we're going to start with Ann Petry's The Street. And I read The Street as a graduate student, and it was haunting and fantastic. It is about a woman, Ludi Johnson, and what she goes through as a Black woman in the 1940s, trying to raise her son, and all the things she goes through, like trying to balance the job with raising her kid and making sure he doesn't get in trouble because he's a little Black boy, as well as being potentially exploited and sexually harassed by her landlord. It's a lot. And it was fantastic. Like I said, I read it as a graduate student, and it also was not that long, but I think that is such required reading when we talk about, again, Black women writing in the Harlem Renaissance and Black women's stories. This to me is a very important one because it speaks to something that, I think a lot of people would resonate with, right? The fact that she is a single mother going through all of this in Harlem. And, I definitely was taken to thinking about my own mother, who was a single parent, and like what it means to be doing all this yourself, and sort of in a time where you like having male protection was more of a thing, but also not having that, or having the protection of a support system, because I believe that Ludi doesn't have much of a support system where she is. So yeah, it was great. It was great. You definitely need to read that. Next, I would say Quicksand and or Passing by Nella Larson. And so Nella Larson too, again, Black women writer during the Harlem Renaissance. Quicksand, I think I read recently, and it was the first book by Nella Larson to be published. Passing is probably the most well known. So, but both of them, I don't think either of them are very long, but I'll read you the synopsis for Quicksand. So, born to a white mother and an absent Black father and despised for her dark skin, Helga Crane has long had to defend herself. As a young woman, Helga teaches at an all-Black school in the South. But even here, she feels different. Moving to Harlem and eventually to Denmark, she attempts to carve out a comfortable life and place for herself, but ends up back where she started, choosing emotional freedom that quickly translates into a narrow existence. Quicksand, Nella Larson's powerful first novel, has intriguing autobiographical parallels and at the same time evokes the international dimension of African-American culture of the 1920s. It also evocatively portrays racial and gender restrictions that can mark a life. And so I think this is a good one too, especially when we start thinking about 1920s, 1930s, negritude, francophone communities, and how Black folk and Black artists in America are writing about and being in international destinations like Europe, where they find like modicums more freedom. So I think that is, these themes become super important to think about. And so I have found that things like Quicksand and other things that I read from Baldwin, if you read Jesse Redmond Fawcett, like all of those, that the importance of Black folks in migratory patterns, even if they are international, is an important thing to sort of take in, even as a part of literature and how it impacts that. Next, we have Cain by John Toomer. And Cain is also one of those required readings, but it's such a strange and beautiful book for both its poetic quality in the prose. And so Cain is structured as a series of vignettes revolving around the origins and experiences of African Americans in the United States. The vignettes alternate in structure between narrative prose, poetry, and what's called like a play, like passages of dialogue. And so because of that, the novel has been classified as a composite novel, or what would we consider a short story cycle. Though some characters and situations recur between the vignettes are mostly freestanding, meaning that they're mostly independent, but they're tied together thematically as well as contextually. So it is, again, when we talk about one, beautiful and interesting prose about Black life, but also because Jean Toomer is doing this interesting way of writing. Super, super, super important, especially if you read other things, I think, by him, including Meridian. I think that's also by Jean Toomer. And so last, as a sort of contemporary book about the Harlem Renaissance, which I'm reading currently, Harlem Rhapsody by Victoria Christopher Murray, which is about the life, especially Jesse Redmond Fawcett, who is the first literary editor of the Crisis magazine, which is the flagship periodical of the NAACP. And it's about her and how she comes to pretty much put all of these Harlem Renaissance artists on, but it's also against the backdrop of her affair with W.E.B. Du Bois. So there's tea, right? But I think it's so cool to like get this fictionalized autobiography of Fawcett, who was a woman's Harlem Renaissance writer as well. But you get the people like Ann Petry and Nella Larson and County Cullen and Langston Hughes, who, for the most part, I think all except Petry maybe, were put on by Nella Larson, or put on by Jesse Redmond Fawcett. So I think that is a really cool way to sort of dip your toes in and become aware of who some of the major players were during the Harlem Renaissance and how they begin to get their foray into writing for real. Now, if we are talking about Black women's writing, right, and I've given you a couple that are just majorly important, I also would stick in here people that you know. So like Toni Morrison, but the book I would say that if you are getting into reading Black literature, start with Sula probably, because Sula is about Black women's relationships, these two friends who grow up differently and sort of the turns that their lives take and how they sort of come in and out of one another's lives. And I think it's a bit of an easier read for Morrison's prose. Is it my favorite of her books? No. I would also place in there maybe Recitative because it's a short story and the only short story that Toni Morrison has written. So if you want to foray into Morrison, but you want something that's going to be a little bit more digestible and sort of manageable, I would say Sula is good, as well as Recitative for its brevity. Then you have Zora Neale Hurston. Now, it might be cliche, but Their Eyes Were Watching God, as especially for Black women, require reading, truly require reading, especially because of the older main character and how she continues to sort of develop her own sensibilities and what life means, what love means, what all of those things actually look like. I think it's important, and Their Eyes Were Watching God is a book to grow with, right? I would also say, and this is not necessarily because it's writing about Black women, but Mules and Men, because folklore is so important, and I don't think we learn enough about folklore. But if Mules of Men takes not short stories, but these tales that Zora Hurston is gathering, and she gives you a sense of like what her experience is gathering these stories from people in Eatonville. And I know for me personally, as someone who is from Central Florida, the stories reminded me a lot of the elders that I grew up with, because, Black Central Floridians for sure definitely have a Southern quality to them. And I know like my grandmother and aunts and my great grandmother, they all were born in the South and sort of migrated to Florida. So I think it's important, especially if you love like tales. I think that Mules and Men is a good one to read. Now, I will also throw in another sort of required reading that I think is easier to digest, and I just remembered it, is A Lesson Before Dying by Ernest J. Gaines. And so I think it's interesting because it takes what is happening in Native Son and puts the POV, the narration, under a different character. So the character that is under is like this teacher who is tasked with talking with and trying to get the story out of a Black man that's going to be sentenced to death for a crime that he did not commit. And so they send this teacher, who's like one of the most educated people in the city, to go talk to him and try to help him as he prepares for his execution. And the frustration of being the most educated in a small town with people with small minds, and racism and things like that. Oh, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. I still think about A Lesson Before Dying as one of my favorite works of classic Black fiction still. So good. Now, if you're trying to get into sci-fi and fantasy or horror, what we got, of course, is Octavia Butler. But I'm not going to suggest the Parables duology, even though it's fantastic. But what I will suggest to you is either Fledgling, which is Butler's take on genetic engineering and vampirism. So you get a different modality in her sci-fi. This is a little bit more technological in ways, but it still has fantasy in it. It has science elements in it. It's fantastic. It is my favorite of Butler's works. And then Bloodchild and Other Stories, for the same reason that I would suggest something like Recitative from Toni Morrison, because it is short stories. It is a collection of Butler short stories, two of which win Hugo and Nebula Awards. And that is like The Evening and the Morning, and I forget which one else. But I love short stories because they give you a sense of the author, and you get the joy of finishing something that doesn't take as long. And what I love about Bloodchild and Other Stories is that there are epilogues after each one of the stories from Butler, where you get a sense of her writerly voice and where she was as she was thinking up and writing each of the short stories. So either of those, absolutely fantastic. Also, The Comet by W.E.B. DuBois. And if you didn't know, DuBois wrote fiction as well. And so The Comet is quite short. I think it's like 10 pages. And it is a dystopian fiction short story. So if you're in Afrofuturism, to me, this would be proto-Afrofuturist because of the way in which it talks about dystopia and science and race and gender and things like that. It's good, actually. My students read it for the class that I teach on Afrofuturism. And then lastly, when we go more into the horror side, again, vampire-esque, is My Soul to Keep by Tenanerive. And it is Ooh, it was good. It was good. I still think about it. I have not finished the series, but I still think about it. I actually might reread My Soul to Keep, because it is about this man named David who's married, has a kid, but he's been keeping from his wife, who's an investigative journalist, that he is an immortal, right? And so his immortal brethren come to his door and say, "Hey girl, you gotta come back to Egypt." And he's like, "I'm not doing that without my wife and my kid." And they're like, "Child, you got to leave them because they are human." As well as people been dying around his wife, and so his wife's trying to figure out, wow, these people is dying around her. So it's very good, and it's going to get you into that sci-fi bordering horror genre, which is really good. And then finally, if we're talking about getting into Black literature, but you want to get into it on the nonfiction side, right? You want to do nonfiction or like kind of academic-y work, I'm going to suggest 3 things to you. One is When Chickenheads Come Home to Roost by Joan Morgan, and this is sort of the first academic type text about hip hop feminism. And I read When Chickenheads Come Home to Roost as an undergraduate, and it changed my life. And so while if you are younger, some of the references may not hit for you like people in my generation as a millennial, you know what I mean? But I think it's wonderful to start thinking about Black womanhood through the language and tenor of at this point, like 80s, 90s Black woman. And Joan Morgan is such a brilliant writer. And I think this is super accessible, especially to talk about Black women and feminism, right? Under the umbrella of hip hop culture, right? So then I would also say Black Women Writers at Work, which was edited by Claudia Tate, in their interviews with some of these powerhouse Black women writers. So Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Alexis DeVoe, Sonia Sanchez, right? Who else? There are a couple other ones. I was like, oh yeah. But these are so good, especially if you want to start thinking about how these writers are thinking about the intersections of their identities, what their responsibility is as writers, all things. So good. And then finally, I would say as a contemporary work that's going to get you into Black studies and Black feminist studies, probably, that would be Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper. Now, do I always agree with Brittany Cooper? No. But I think that, and I found myself in Eloquent Rage as a Black woman of a certain level of education and intellect who exists in this sort of contemporary world, and like what some of the ramifications of that are. And so having people write through or talk through that in ways that sort of resonate with you is not interesting, but it's necessary. And it helps you to see yourself in sort of critical ways, and like helps invite you to think through those things. So yeah, that's what I got for y'all as your friendly neighborhood African-American things professor. So let me know, have you read any of the books that I have mentioned, or are you going to put them on your list? Are there some that I didn't mention that you don't hear about that maybe I should mention or talk about in more depth? Now, let me know in the downstairs or the comment section. And as always, friends, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, tell a friend about the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.